Welcome, Peter, to the Flagstaff Gallery. Lovely to have you here. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background with regard to art and how you got involved in being a professional artist?
Well, I've always, ever since I was little, I've drawn lots. But I went to university and studied pure mathematics. Well, in actual fact, has a wee bit of a connection to art. But then I worked 4 years in the media, in television, and I liked the visualness of the medium. But I decided to take art more seriously a few years later.
Why do you choose to work in painting?
I like the fluidity of it, and particularly the way I'm working at the moment, to get a paint that flows freely with a nice viscosity is very pleasurable.
Are there any problems you face in approaching painting in the way you do?
The paint has a mind of its own. It tends to go its own way, so it's a matter of trying to apply some sort of control so the images that I'm trying to produce, which are mainly people, faces and figures, I can get them accurate enough and still maintain that spontaneity and fluidity of the line. So it's a bit of a balancing act, really.
And what is the primary motivation behind your work?
I like making lines, whether it's drawing lines or painting lines. Yes, basically.
Are there any themes or issues you wish the viewer to take away with them when they view your work?
Well, because a lot of my drawing is done out in the public arena, just into little moleskin sketchbooks, I do quick ink line drawings, and I want to get an accuracy and a spontaneity of drawings of people out in the environment doing what they do. So there's a lot of reportage in that, and to try and translate that into a painting, whether it's a humorous conversation or a serious discussion or political protest or whatever.
Are there any scenes or faces that particularly attract you or that you look for?
I tend to like doing profiles, but all faces are interesting, and that's my way of working. I treat all faces as being interesting, and if you get a good drawing of a face, well, then it's liable to end up in a painting.
Which artists have influenced you?
Well, I've always liked Modigliani because he drew heaps and he's very much a line drawer. He doesn't shade much. I like Toulouse-Lautrec's drawings and paintings. Tos Williston's drawings, his ink drawings.
What challenges do you face creating art in New Zealand?
Well, not too many. I'd imagine, having travelled overseas quite a bit, that artists in New Zealand, it's probably easier in a lot of ways because studio spaces are cheaper, more available. The pressure on artists in New York or Berlin or wherever, New York, be much more difficult in New Zealand. I've had New York artists come into my studio and say, if I only could have that in New York, you know. So it's probably less stressful in a lot of ways. And as I've painted a lot of New Zealand landscape over the years as well, and I like New Zealand landscape, so I'm happy working in New Zealand.
Do you find New Zealand influences your work?
It's about all I do, really. I have done paintings from New York from a study period that I spent there in the 90s, and I've recently been to Berlin, and figures from Berlin are starting to appear in my paintings, but most of my work originates from New Zealand. Ideas here, landscape here, people here.
What excites you most about going to New York?
I'd like to go back there, actually. I've made a number of visits to New York. I visited there in 1972 when graffiti art was really taking off, and I was totally stimulated by that, how all the subway trains and stations were painted. This New York then was in the sort of state of anarchy with the Vietnam War happening then, and protest, and all the rock and roll music that was coming out of there, and the art was just taking off too, particularly street art. So, and I visited there in the 90s too. And New York's been tidied up a bit, so it's probably very tidy now, but I'd like to go back.
It certainly must have provided you a lot of subject matter to explore with the faces and
Yes,
conversations.
that's what I like about big cities. Actually, I'd prefer to live in the country, but I like going to big cities to have the variety of faces to draw. The recent trip to Berlin was really stimulating for that, and New York, there's plenty of faces in New York, and I could fill up sketchbooks going there, so I'd look forward to that trip again.
What do you hope to bring to New York? What do you hope to bring to the New York exhibition?
Oh, paintings that people will remember, that they feel they haven't seen this sort of painting before, that the images will stay in their minds, and a bit of excitement. I like people to react positively, or negatively, but definite reaction to my work.
And finally, what are your thoughts on the Flagstaff Gallery bringing New Zealand art to New York?
I think it's a very good idea. It's very brave of them, really, because there's so much work involved and cost, but I think New Yorkers could do with seeing a bit of New Zealand art, and that's great.